I haven't heard the interpretation, like what you just described, which it just connected all the dots in my synapses. Um, but like his initial dream, I think my sisters have actually joked about that. Like they've been like, yeah, if we heard something like that from you, we'd be like, no, I mean, we wouldn't sell you into slavery, but you know,
Right.
you know, but it's always, the story is always told like a comeuppance. Like it's almost like, well, Joseph was faithful, and you know, look at what happened to the brothers. Like they didn't have their food, and he rose to this position of power and all this kind of stuff. But um, the way you just described it is yeah, because I think turning the page, like that juxtaposition, I think is not. I guess how many years is it between the time that like
Yeah, about
Genesis
400 years.
400 years? Okay.
Yeah, so it's a pretty long minute.
Yeah.
So in the end, did
Yeah.
Joseph just give grain to his family, or did he give grain to feed a lot of other people? 'Cause
It's
it
a lot
said
of it's a lot of people.
a lot of people.
But he's not just giving it. It's an economy of exchange.
No, I mean in the very, very end. After all when the brothers came back and he finally gave them grain, isn't that towards the end of the famine?
No, I mean,
No?
no, he's giving them, he's saving them, and that's kind of at the, like, there's been this famine, and they've come down from Canaan, down to Egypt, and he provides for them then. But then when it all goes nationwide,
Okay.
that's when,
Yeah.
that's when things kind of, I think,
Because the project said at the very end of that,
fall apart.
that page said he saved many lives.
Yeah,
That Joseph saved many. Well, who was the lives that he saved?
yeah, I guess he's all those who became slaves. So
Yeah.
what's an interesting part of that bit is there is one group that's allowed to maintain land, and it's the priests. And it's like quintessential empire building, right? If you can control the religious leaders, you can control the masses, because they'll tell the people, hey, this is what your God wants of you. It's like in chess, right? Like the most expendable part of a chessboard is your pawns. We even call them that, pawns, right? They can just go out. You can sacrifice them. It's interesting. It's a game in which a king can never be killed, right? You can put a king in check. You can it ends in checkmate, but the king never actually gets captured. The king never actually dies. The queen can die. The queen can be captured, but the king cannot. Because right before the king gets captured, the game's over. And then what's closest to the king and queen is not their physical power, the rooks, and it's not even the cavalry. They're knights. What's the closest two pieces to the king and queen?
It's the pawn.
Nope,
Bishops.
it's the bishops.
Oh, the bishop. Yeah,
Yeah, the pawn. Yeah, I mean yeah. You control the religious leaders, and you control the people.
And last week when we talked about the ark, instead of the details.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at the ark, is that there couldn't have been a Moses without slaves.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's all, and as you said too, Tom, earlier, all of these folks are just broken people, right? And it doesn't get fixed until Christ comes, right? So the long arc is going to be this, that God is going to be faithful to his promise to Abraham, but God is faithful to his promise to Abraham, not because Abraham or Abraham's other descendants are ever actually faithful, but because eventually there is a descendant of Abraham, and his name is Jesus, who is faithful. So I do want to come back around to Hagar in a second, but there's this, this didn't make the video, but in that chapter 15 and 17, where they're making the covenant, and they showed it with Abraham kind of looking up at the stars, which I thought was a beautiful way to do it. But there's part of that story, 15 I guess it is, where when the covenant is cut, you cut a covenant, right? Blood is spilled in covenant making in the ancient world. When you cut the covenant, the vision that Abraham has is of animal pieces being kind of in a row, and a cauldron of fire passing between the animal pieces. So what should have happened is that Abraham should have passed between them, saying, if I break the covenant, this is what can happen to me. But instead, it's the cauldron of fire that passes between them. God is saying, if the covenant is broken, this is what will happen to me. And I think that's exactly what happens. Abraham breaks the covenant, and God dies. Right? Abraham and his descendants are the broken people, just like Adam and Eve and Noah and Cain and Abel, right? And Isaac and Jacob, and I would say also Joseph, right? They all break it. And so in the breaking of the covenant, God has passed through the slaughtered animals, meaning that when the covenant's broken, that's the one who will die. And that's exactly what happens. God comes and dies. Right? But of course, God also resurrects, right? Because God's the God of life. That tree of life, right? You can cut down the tree, but the tree is the seed of doing, is putting all these things. So that's, I think, the way, I think that's the way Paul's reading Abraham and Adam, right? So in Romans 4, Paul will talk about Abraham's faithfulness. In Romans 5, Paul will talk about Christ as the second, or is it last, Adam. And I think what he's doing there is he's saying Jesus' faithfulness fulfills the covenant to Abraham. So God is actually faithful on both sides. God's faithful because he's never broken it. And turns out God comes in the flesh and lives out the human side of the covenant, so that it's a descendant of Abraham who fulfills the human side. So in the covenant to Abraham, there's a God side and there's a human side, Abraham's side, right? And God's, of course, faithful. God doesn't back out on any way. But since Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Joseph or Moses or David or whoever, right, never actually gets it right, a descendant of Abraham, Jesus, is faithful. But that's God in the flesh. So really, the reason we can have assurance in our faith is that God's plan to redeem his broken and rebellious world, I love the way they said that, God's plan to redeem his rebellious world is a plan where he's made a covenant that he is faithful to on both sides. So that's blessed assurance, Jesus is mine, oh what a foretaste of glory divine. That's why we can be sure of our salvation. Because God has said, I'll save, and God comes and saves, right? God fulfills the covenant on both ends. What do you think about that?
I like that.
I do want to say something about Hagar.
Here's what I found.
Nope. I didn't want you to say something about it. I want to say.
Yeah, Siri wants to say something about it.
Yeah, so she's never named by Sarah or Abraham. She's only referred to as the slave girl, which I think is quintessential the way and kind of a hierarchy of humanity we treat those below us, right? But the messenger of the Lord speaks to her and says Hagar, like calls her by name. And then while she is running and with her child and there's no way to provide for him and she thinks they're going to die, God comes to her again and promises to create for her descendants. Like in the ancient world, women didn't have descendants. Like Adam has descendants, Noah has descendants, Abraham has descendants. Women don't have descendants in the ancient world, but she is promised descendants. And so you get her name, you get her value, and all of that is in the story, but it's always coming from God. Right? It's the God character in the story, or God's messenger, that's seeing her, that's knowing her, that's calling by her name, and that's promising her things that women just aren't promised in the ancient world. And I love that part of, like, she's I think we sometimes downplay how much Abraham and Sarah mistreat her, because obviously they're the ones in the story we're trying to emulate. They're they're the good guys, right? The good characters. And she's just an unfortunate character, right? So but I think we are complex people. We too are broken, and we need to be aware of that and come to grips with that, and that's why we need forgiveness. It's why we need therapy. It's why we need each other to hold each other accountable, and so we serve the God, and then we'll see this next week as we get into Exodus. We don't serve the God of the kings, right? The Egyptians, the pharaohs. We serve the God of the slaves, right? We serve the God who sees Hagar and calls her by name. We serve the God who identifies with the least, the lost, and the broken. It's kind of what I was trying to say this Sunday. We talked about Jesus' baptism, right? Not being kind of saved from the water, but going down into the water, but not to stay there, but to come out of it, right? To come through it. Like, I think that's the story of salvation, that he identifies with us in all of our brokenness, but then he doesn't leave us there. He comes up and raises us with him, and that's the redemption.
And he also said that I think that Jesus wasn't the one that was baptized; he was baptizing the water.
I said, that Jesus wasn't cleansed in any way in the baptism.
Right.
But Jesus cleansed the water.
For us.
Yeah. We looked around. Mikkel and I both were looking for various, because that particular idea actually is scattered throughout hundreds of years in the early church. It's a popular thing to say in sermons, and I think the earliest reference I found was Irenaeus, which is 2nd century. So that's pretty early.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that it was
It was
something
real popular, wasn't it?
Yeah, oh yeah. A lot of people said it. That's why it was hard to kind of nail down. But and I think that kind of speaks to kind of like the binding of Isaac. Like, it's a story where we're not exactly sure what to make of it. I think a lot of people know.
Like the baptism of Jesus.
The baptism of Jesus.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. We know what baptism is. We know what it does. Why did Jesus need to do that? And I mean, next week we'll get into the story of the Exodus. Jesus goes down into the water. All of these stories about people who pass through the water, but the water doesn't touch them. Jesus isn't one of those. Yeah. Jesus goes down into the depths. Jesus goes to Pharaoh. Jesus goes to Pharaoh's armies. Jesus goes to the dead. Jesus goes to the chaos. Mm-hmm. And
like the psalmist says, even if I make my bed in Sheol, you are there.
Yeah, Jesus is there, down in the depths. I do love the story of Jacob. I've never really kind of had an appreciation for it until recently in life. Jacob in Scripture, I feel like so many of these Old Testament characters tend to be a little bit static, right? Like, they don't really have like arcs to their story, right? Noah kind of has one, but it's not a good, like, Noah starts off as being this one that's kind of favored by God, but then the story ends real bad, And there's a lot of those kinds of, I guess, characters in the Bible. But Jacob has this really kind of redemptive arc to his story, right? Like, he starts off as this character who is very complex and very, very opportunistic, right? He's kind of portrayed as this guy who, is out for himself and kind of looking to see who he can one up, or who he can own, so to speak. He cheats his brother, he cheats his dad, he tries to cheat his uncle. His uncle ends up cheating him, but then he gets the last word with his flocks. What's his uncle's name? Laban. He ends up cheating his uncle out of a bunch of goats, and so he's this kind of like real cunning character, and has this kind of humbling experience. He has this encounter with God. He ends up kind of walking differently, I find the parallel of him being kind of named ankle grabber, and God touches his leg, and he walks with a limp. Like there's a parallel there that I can't put my finger on there, but I'm sure someone smart has already worked on that. But at the end of his life, there's this story of Joseph, and you know, if you're a character like Jacob was early on in his life, where you're trying to wheel and deal and, you know, glad hand and see who you can kind of take advantage of, and here you're meeting Pharaoh, right? Well, that's an opportunity for that kind of a person, right? But Jacob is so different at the end of his life that, you know, Pharaoh asks him about his age, and he gives him this kind of sort of like non-answer, and he blesses Pharaoh, and then he turns and walks away. It says he turned around and left, which I don't know, I don't think you probably, but you know, the fact that he ends up to be one who blesses Pharaoh rather than trying to extract or grab or take or gain, like it shows kind of how far his arc went, like how different he
That is
wound
good.
up being.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, the very
didn't get
fact
that. Could you try?
the very fact that his, you know, name gets changed from deceiver to wrestles with God. And there's so much to learn just in that alone, right? One of the things, you know, the rabbis all preferred Abraham over Noah because, not so much with the binding of Isaac story, but in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, which Alan mentioned earlier, it didn't make the video, but in that story, Abraham wrestles with God. He's like, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
And you see Jacob kind of wrestling with God. Noah kind of, when God said, I'm going to wipe this out, kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah, I'm going to wipe this out. Noah's just quiet and complicit. And they're like, Noah didn't learn anything. Noah's not the one to emulate. Abraham, who wrestles, that's what God wants. Like, Jacob's name is not just a name that identifies him, it's almost a reward. It's like, he becomes an exemplar that, you know, so rabbis would say the Torah is not just to be, it's not just a fact to be observed. It's something precious to be considered, right? And so the right way to treat the Torah is to not just read it, but to discuss it and even argue about it, right? So we're wrestling with it. Like that's what you're supposed to do. And it's in that kind of interaction, not just with the text, but with God, right? That makes us into who we are. Like God is relationally developing us, not just, you know, from a distance. All right, it's 8 o'clock. Are we still on the live stream? To come back? Yeah, so we'll continue with big picture, big long arc pictures. Live streamers, hopefully we'll get this internet issue worked out, and we'll be consistent, and we'll continue our work. God bless everybody. As you had said something.